I'm honored by this invitation to participate in a series of lectures on a topic so timely and controversial. What exactly are we to make of the past as it's been handed down to us and as we are to hand it down to our descendants? There's little agreement, after all, on whether the past we transmit is largely recovered as it was, or largely revised in light of present troubles, whether it's a burden to be put aside and even repent. Do the sequence of atrocities or great sacrifices and beneficent achievements mark our history? And is the answer to that question true or false? I don't have time to tell you what I think about these things, but I hope some of my other observations will contribute to this project. I am Barry Schwartz, and I'll call my talk, delivered from behind my highly artistic podium, Memory and Truth. Truth is no longer what it's used to be. In fact, we now reside in a post-truth society. The Oxford Dictionary, an authoritative source of information on current language trends, defined the post-truth adjective as the 2006 word of the year, the new word which best summarized the consciousness of our time. The post-truth era refers to, quote, circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than emotional appeals. The Mueller Committee, for example, found no evidence that Trump collaborated with Russia in 2016, but that doesn't mean he's innocent. How could such a vulgar and unpleasant fellow not be guilty? A year earlier, the American Dialect Society defined truthiness as the word of the year. Truthiness reflects statements which, independently of the facts or their absence, are considered true because they feel true. How many will deny that slavery is the ultimate source of the entire span of African American social problems, from the breakdown of the family to crime and poverty and so forth? Well, the vast preponderance of evidence rejects that proposition, but it feels right. Think of it. Truthiness is in a post-truth era. No correspondence can be more relevant to collective memory scholarship. Let me be more specific. Collective memory's fallibility is well demonstrated. Its power is less so. How ironic it is that so much ink has been spilled on memory's incidental functions, forgetting or exaggerating of wrongdoing, giving voice to the poor and the oppressed, making the marginalized feel better about themselves, while its major function is to bring us into more direct contact with the past, even the ancient past. This emphasis has led to nothing significant in the way of theoretical advance. The emphasis on the failings of collective memory has taken us nowhere. Collective memory's contribution to Homo sapiens survival is not in its malleability or the truthiness thereof. Rather, memory enhances survival because it permits us to retain and recover so much of the past. Collective memory does not and cannot work perfectly, but if it did not work well enough for practical purposes which make the human species unique, then human society would be impossible. Now, I'm not the only complainer in the House. Paul Ricoeur was right when he warned against those who approach memory on the basis of its deficiencies and therefore mask its indispensability to history. My talk today is going to bypass issues concerning the sources and consequences of collective memory, that is, how it reflects the distribution of power and social tensions and the winds of culture. The point of my talk is more fundamental. Memory needs a better conceptualization of its own object. It needs to know more about itself. The study of the past, how it's known, interpreted, and preserved, is currently in a very ambiguous state. According to one prominent psychologist, memory, by and large, reflects reality, but as he puts it, distortions can arise due to its constructive nature. But to what extent does memory's constructive nature increase its capacity to twist reality? A great deal. Emphasis on the past being reconstituted in the process of being recovered is symptomatic of a social science culture plagued by excessive, pathological, and often paralyzing cynicism. A research culture so determined to disclose memory's deficiencies, especially in areas of class, race, gender, oppression, and victimhood, that its scholars usually choose topics in which deficiencies are most evident. Books and journals typically show memory at its worst because few scholars or editors or readers are interested in cases of accurate memory. Who needs it? Who's interested in it? The consequence, then, is, quote, a body of evidence, unquote, which exaggerates distortion and forgetting. Now, let me back off a little bit by saying that the situation must be rightly understood. Man's capacity to alter history is universal and infinite. All perceptions of the past are necessarily partial. Those who remember the 9/11 Twin Tower collapse remember something altogether different depending on which side of the buildings they were standing, or whether they were home watching television, and if so, what channel did they have on. Denial of the great genocide of Armenians, conservative Japanese efforts to transform World War II into a defensive war, French nationalists transforming their forebears' collaboration with the Nazis into fierce resistance against them, the oblivion among Western Jews of Shalem Schwartz, David Frankfurter, Herschel Greenspan, the first to stand up against and kill their people's tormentors, a people whose many local leaders failed them utterly. You talk to some of the folks at the temple, at the Jewish temple here in Athens, and 9 out of 10 will tell you they've never heard of any of these three guys. As we move from democratic to authoritarian states like China, the Third World, the old Soviet Union, that is, from open to closed societies, access to historical information diminishes. No one, therefore, can claim that efforts to remake the past are rare. But this fact makes memory distortion in open societies, to which I'll confine myself today, all the more problematic. New section. What exactly do we mean by collective memory? The term is often reputed to be ambiguous and complex. In fact, few concepts are clearer or simpler, but only when recognized for the entity that it is. That is, something that is inextricably linked to history and commemoration. Let's first make a few comments about history, which is an ancient discipline and admits of many definitions. Collective memory, on the other hand, is a new discipline. It's less than 100 years old. And its scholars are most familiar with the definition proposed by its pioneer, Maurice Obvox. History, as Obvox defines it, seeks an objective standpoint to assess the causes and consequences of events. It's situated external to and above groups and individual interests, and describes the past independently of contemporary conditions. Once established, Obvox believes, historical knowledge remains stable, its stream of facts and demarcations fixed once and for all. Obvox is a little optimistic, don't you think? But let's be generous by recognizing history's superior objectivity relative to memory and commemoration. First, let's get into memory. As history alone is objective and stands above groups, Obvox believe that memory, individual and collective alike, is situation dependent. But collective memory needs to be assessed at two different levels. The term biographical memory refers to what individuals know, believe, and feel about themselves at earlier times in their lives. They do so by means of the brain's storage and recall systems, which mediate information from parents, family members, friends, acquaintances, diaries, photo albums, recordings, birthdays, anniversaries, cultural and social events in which individuals locate their own past within the wider world. A lot of things that you all remember about your youth were simply told to you by adults, and now they're part of your memory. And by the way, what were you doing last Thanksgiving, and where were you in 9/11 or when Kennedy was shot? These are the social frames of individual memory. Individual memories are fundamental units of collective memory, but collective memory, the topic of this talk, refers to the distribution. Listen carefully. Collective memory refers to the distribution throughout society of what individuals know, believe, and feel about bygone events and persons, how they judge them morally, how closely they identify with them, and how much they're inspired by them as a model for their own conduct and identity. Individuals cannot remember historical events which occurred before they were born and beyond their present experiences. But it would be a mistake to conclude that the collective memory of such occurrence is merely a metaphor based on the more familiar term, individual memory. Metaphors fail to show what collective memory is or what it does. Different people have always interpreted the same events in different ways. As an entity whose key property is variation, therefore, collective memory cannot be fully shared. The adjective collective is not synonymous with consensual. That memory distributions also have a central tendency, due to interpretive overlap, makes total dissensus, total chaos, equally impossible. The heart of the matter is this. Similar beliefs about the past appear among individuals and communities altogether unknown and to each other and widely dispersed geographically. Well, that to me is miraculous. Similar memories are possessed by individuals who don't know each other. They've never met, and they're scattered all over the society. And yet they think about particular events in essentially the same way. This means that their thoughts, these individual thoughts and these feelings, reflect a transcendent condition common to all. Collective memory must therefore be treated as a superpersonal or emergent entity, connecting otherwise disconnected individuals and communities. In other words, collective memory is something you cannot see. You know it only by its consequences, which I've just described. A useful analogy to collective memory is public opinion. Opinions, like memories, can only be held by individuals and can only be assessed by questioning individuals. But when these opinions are aggregated, they assume a totally new significance. Collective opinion affects the way the average person thinks about matters of the day. It renders him more or less confident in his own personal opinions. Public opinion and collective memory alike elevate or diminish the public mood, affect elections, define the appropriateness of given lines of conduct. Collective memory, public opinion, they are first cousins. Now, an important distinction. Although collective memory and public opinion are similarly constituted, that is, they are both emergent, superpersonal, transcendent entities, and although they exert their effects in similar ways, collective memory represents itself not only by what individuals in the aggregate believe about past incidents and persons, but also by multiple forms of commemorative symbolism. Now, I say to you that if you skim through some of the journals of our field, you will find that most of the articles in these journals are about commemoration, not collective memory. It's very difficult to study collective memory. You must take survey, you must take national surveys, or you must interview 1,000,001 people. It's a very, very expensive to get data on this subject. Commemoration, in contrast to collective memory, distinguishes events and purposes to be deserving of celebration and censure from those merely deserving to be remembered. The primary vehicles of commemoration are highly selective. They include objects which lift, think of it this way, commemoration lifts objects which are part of the historical record. It focuses in on particular objects, a limited set of objects, and objects which represent society's conception of its highest ideals and profoundest depravities. These commemoration lifts out from the historical record and sits before us in concrete form. Commemorative writing includes eulogies, poems, plays, commentaries motivated by reverence or enmity, emphasizing the moral rather than factual aspects of the past. Commemorative texts lean toward hagiography or condemnation, and thus distinguishable from chronicling and analytic history. Commemorative music consists of anthems, hymns, and songs of repentance, aligning melodic and harmonic structures and lyrics to historical entities in such a way as to dramatize the latter significance. Icons, which are signs that resemble what they represent, commemorate the past by bringing to visual presence through paintings, statues, prints, photographs, motion picture, film, television, and video. Monuments, including obelisks, antique temples, and other memorial structures, are designed to elevate the public imagination by dramatic reference to great events and their men. Shrines, which include birthplaces, residences, state buildings, military headquarters, battle sites, sites of death, bring the individual into direct contact with ancient persons and events. Allow him literally to walk in his footsteps and touch the things that he touched. I went to Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois, and I did just that. The idea that Lincoln walked here is just stunning. It's absolutely stunning, mind-boggling. Commemoration is also realized in naming patterns, which make the past ubiquitous by incorporating it into the identity of businesses, streets, cities, towns, counties, states, rivers, lakes, and mountains. Observances, including periodic performances of anniversaries, centennial, and holiday rites, perform the same functions to maintain the memory of extraordinary events and persons, and to preserve it within the collective consciousness. Well, my God, with all of these things, how can you forget? And so one must not underestimate the importance of commemoration in preserving our past. We can now state the relations among history, commemoration, and memory. History's goal is to rationalize the past, commemoration and its sites to sanctify it. History makes the past an object of analysis, commemoration an object of commitment. History represents known facts and their sequence. Commemoration is a symbol system that simplifies events of the past and clarifies the moral sentiments they inspire. History, like science, investigates the world by producing models of its permanence and change. Commemoration, like ideology, seeks to promote commitment to the world by producing symbols of its values and achievements. History and commemoration are at once the sources, the vehicles, and the products of collective memory. Nowhere is the interdependence among memory, commemoration, and history more evident than in the field of biblical studies. James Dunn, prominent among historical Jesus scholars, declares that the quest for the historical Jesus can only be a quest for Jesus as remembered by contemporaries and successors, men and women who told or wrote about him, and so marked the memory of a life that historians and commemorative agents have preserved. History, although more objective in its methods and aims, is utterly dependent on how individuals, its individual subjects, including Jesus, are collectively remembered and commemorated. Now I would like to say something to you about the way that collective memory gets started. Many remembrances go back to time immemorial. and others have more recent and ascertainable starting points. Almost nothing was known about Abraham Lincoln's young adulthood when he was assassinated in 1865. William Herndon, who's Lincoln's law partner, located and interviewed 250 informants, including many former New Salem, Illinois residents who had known Lincoln while he lived there in the 1830s. Because 35 to 40 years had passed since these people had last seen Lincoln, an interval equivalent to those separating Mark's gospel from the crucifixion. Herndon conscientiously weeded out rumors, mistakes, in order to estimate the truth value of New Salem's informants. He then used this revised store of information to publish the most comprehensive biography to date of Lincoln's early life. As a second example, Katsuuchi Honda, during the late 1960s, interviewed survivors of the December 1937, February 1938 Nanking Massacre. The illiterate victims could not have written their own stories, but their oral tellings, after more than 30 years, enlarged the records of the war crime tribunals. Once again, I want to stress that these witnesses, these retellings, were for the most part confirmed by others. Memories of Abraham Lincoln and the Nanking Massacre were transmitted orally across generations and retained long after the people who originally reported them had scattered or died. As these memories were passed on, they were modified, but their essence remained unchanged. How they stabilized, how they preserved reality in the face of rapid social change, this is the problem. And in order to deal with that problem, I have to talk to you a little bit about the concept of redundancy. The Lincoln and Nanking narratives, both based on personal testimony, show that the memory of a single event may have more than one original version. Mark that down. Edmund Leach explains how this is so in his account of how myths are transmitted. He gives us this example. Try to imagine yourself in the situation of an individual A, who's trying to get a message to a friend B who's almost out of earshot. And let us suppose that communication is further hampered by different kinds of interference, noise from the wind, from passing cars, and so forth. So what will A do? What will person A do? Well, if he's sensible, he'll not be satisfied with shouting his message just once. He will shout it several times and give a different wording to the message each time, supplementing his words with visual signals. At the receiving end, B may likely get the meaning of each of the individual messages slightly wrong. But when he puts them together, the redundancies and the mutual consistencies and inconsistencies will make it clear what is really being said. In brief, the meaning of a message is not in any single one of its versions, but in all the versions taken together. This is the way Lincoln's youth and the way the Nanking Massacre were recovered. To return to the examples noted earlier, Abraham Lincoln's friends did not fall silent when he died, and the survivors of Japan's invasion of Nanking did not forget their suffering after their city was liberated. However, eyewitnesses need not have told the same story in order for a good estimate of the real Lincoln and the real Nanking atrocity to appear on the receiving end. As Leach suggests, the more varied the narrative, the more accurately it's conveyed and remembered. Such stories contain bits of information that are individually vague but coherent in their assemblage. Now, a word about the exteriority of collective memory. That is, a word about historically authentic memory. Such memory must, by definition, be reliable. Its contents cannot vary wildly across time and space. So, if you have a narrative of, a given event, and that narrative changes just totally, say from one point of time to the other, well, it's unreliable, and therefore we can't give it any credence. Biographies of George Washington, in contrast, which were written in 1800 and 1900 and 2000, and many years in between, they differed. Each of these biographies reflected the world, the troubles, the problems, the joys in which it was produced. But the essence of his life, its guiding pattern from young adulthood to final retirement and death, remained the same over 200 years. How can this be? Well, historical information remains stable when multiple narratives, that is, multiple books about Washington, become independent of their tellers. Folklore study demonstrates the point. Late 19th and early 20th century French folklorists recorded almost 10,000 popular tales representing stable oral traditions spanning centuries. These anonymous storytellers, according to Robert Darnton, the great cultural anthropologist, kept the main elements of the traditional narratives intact, using repetitions, rhymes, and other mnemonic devices. These stories provide a point of entry into the mental world of the French peasant, who passed them on because he found in them a picture of himself and the hardships of his world. Folklorists could never reach this point, had they confined themselves to one version of a story or to fine points of detail, and they felt no need to do so. With 35 variations of Little Red Riding Hood, 90 on Tom Thumb, 105 on Cinderella, there's sufficient redundancy to discern the stem story's theme, style, and tone. Redundancy discloses a collective memory that precedes and transcends any particular storytelling. And I might add, just getting off track for a moment, these stories were very cruel. The French peasants lived in a very difficult world. They had toothaches all the time. They were hungry all the time. And many of the stories, Hansel and Gretel, for example, as well as Red Riding Hood, as you can see, involves the killing and cannibalization of other children. This was a very, very tough world. And these fairy tales capture it. Stepmothers, the wicked stepmothers. Well, why so many wicked stepmothers? Because women died. So many women died in childbirth. And so the father had to find another wife to replace her, a stepmother, who had children of her own, and so forth. Recent data further demonstrate the stickiness of emergent narratives. Over a 13-year period, historian Michael Frisch instructed his students, college students, to write down 10 names that you think about in American history from its beginning to the end of the Civil War. And he posed the question to students with one or no previous courses in American history, and at 2 different universities in 2 different states. And again, this is over a 13-year period. The student cohorts had no previous communication with one another. They used different textbooks, went to different high schools, and had different teachers. Nevertheless, their rank orderings of significant figures in American history were almost identical over the entire 13-year time span. Because the names Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson, in that order, occupied the top 3 presidential ranks for every test group, because these and other rankings were independent of knowledge of American history or differences in regional background, and because the test subjects regularly listed historical figures unmentioned in the standard text, notably Betsy Ross. Frisch infers the existence of a collective fixation on beginnings, a collective fixation on origins, on foundings. In his words, the list is not only composed of quasi-mythic figures, like Betsy Ross, as a collective portrait. It has a kind of mythic structure and completeness itself, a character confirmed by its recreation year after year in nearly identical terms. Collective memory's consistency, Frisch concludes, presupposes its independence of the individuals who retrieve and transmit it. The redundancies in the scores of French and American stories are generalizable to other oral and written histories, including the New Testament. Although there are only 4 partially independent Gospels in the New Testament, they make up in time and topic what they lack in number. They refer to Jesus, a real historical figure. Were based on an oral tradition comprising the memories of interacting contemporaries, remained after their tellers vanished, and conformed to external independent sources, including Paul's letters, several Roman and Judean historical accounts, Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus's sources, and the anonymous Q written Quelle, which appeared identically and independently in Matthew and Luke, but are, of course, external to both. Such stories are what one sociology called collective representations, or social facts, which preserve what Jesus' contemporaries, like Lincoln's, knew and told one another about him over a 30-year period. Memories of Jesus thus transcend and survive their individual sources. I might just add here, in addition, very quickly, that much of the testimony about Jesus was memorized. This was an era where there was very few people wrote, and people passed on to others, to subsequent generations and to peers, their remembrances of events which they memorized. They passed on to them speeches that they held in memory. The rabbis at the time depended solely upon memory when they spoke to their Jewish or Christian congregations. Does all this mean that the Gospels reflect the life of Jesus? Yeah, but no more than any series of books reflect the life of Thomas Jefferson. No more than any series of skeletal remains reflect the path of evolution. No more than, however, once a memory is established within a collectivity, it's difficult to modify, let alone ignore. In Georg Zimmel's words, memory is path dependent. That is to say, we're free to make the first move, but we're servants of the second. To the extent that earlier gospel interpretations contributed to the content of later ones, for example, the latter possessed an inertia that only dramatic social change could modify. That 90% of the first gospel, Mark's, and the most accurate, appear in Matthew and Luke. 90% of Mark appears in Matthew and Luke, exemplifies the relevance of path dependency for the continuity and credibility of collective memory. A couple words about the preservation of collective memory. Well, coherence of historical description results not only from the obdurateness of the reality it represents, but also because that reality inspires preservation. It inspires transmission. It demands it. Yet the perpetuation of material things, writings, recordings, and paintings stored in archives and museums or preserved on film are necessary but insufficient conditions of preservation, for many objects thus preserved are totally unknown or ignored. Because effective preservation maintains the past as a living thing, it requires a cognitive bridge connecting past and present. And to this end, events worth preserving must be relevant to the present and resonate with its conditions. Specifically, I would like for you to think about the concept of keying, that is Keying. Keying makes this connection between present and past by aligning current events with happenings in the past, thus creating historical frames which shape the meaning of current events. For example, Abraham Lincoln invoked the American Revolution as a frame for the Civil War by keying his Gettysburg Address into it 77 years ago, and so forth. Carl Sandburg described the liberating power of Roosevelt's New Deal by calling it the new emancipation. Similarly, the Gospels keyed Jesus' activities and fate to Hebrew scriptures, an estimated 300 times. What we call the Old Testament strikingly frames the life of Jesus. The New Testament, to borrow from Solomon's proverb, is the apple of gold in the Old Testament's frame of silver. The new is keyed to the old frames the new. This reciprocal relation between keying and framing is what makes preservation of the past relevant and therefore vital to the new, and the other way around. I'm now approaching the core of my talk. Historical events and persons are really unobservable, and the only way you can know them is through memories of their influence on contemporaries. But how much stock can be placed in recent, let alone ancient remembrances? The fragile relation between memory and history stems largely from the mentality of contemporary humanities and social science scholars, who, being more suspicious of knowledge today than in any preceding generation, are more impressed than ever by memory's imperfections. The new mood has its virtues, including the protection it affords against naive realism. But if we don't recognize this mood for what it is, we lose much more than we gain. To say that history and memory are more selective and less objective than commonly believed is to make a useless statement. For partial, that is to say selective knowledge, is not synonymous with faulty knowledge. To remember the many instances of Abraham's willingness to renege on his Emancipation Proclamation in return for reunion and peace cannot be dismissed as mere cherry-picking. If the Confederacy would have reciprocated, the war would have ended with slavery intact. Accounts of Lincoln's initiatives are deemed partial or cherry-picked only when they fail. By contrast, no one considers reports on the surrender at Appomattox as cherry-picking. In short, refusal to recognize the reality of selected events and persons simply because they are selective confounds the relation among history, memory, and truth. The problem of incomplete information by Maurice Halbwachs, with whom few scholars today take serious issue, complicates the problem. In the legendary topography of the gospel, he declares, "If as we believe," now listen to this, "if as we believe, collective memory is essentially a reconstruction of the past, if it adapts the image of ancient facts to the beliefs and spiritual needs of the present, then a knowledge of the origin of these facts must be secondary, if not altogether useless, for the reality of the past is no longer in the past." In other words, the reality of the past is in the present. After 70 years of subsequent scholarship, this statement seems as if it were made yesterday, which is precisely the problem. No one can doubt that present conditions motivate us to remember selectively, but Halbwachs makes no provision for present conditions as a route to selective historical realities. In the classic words of Lindesmith and Strauss, memory is a form of perception of the past. As such, memory is inherently selective and variable. Different people remember different things and reconstruct them in different ways. Motivations and needs, in their words, sensitize us to specific stimuli and sometimes lead to distorted perception. But these facts should not cause us to ignore the further fact that reality sets limits to perception. No one can live in a real world if he only sees what suits him. Unquote. However, the assumptions of a realist as opposed to constructionist conception of memory are quite modest. Specifically, perception of an event is more often forced upon the observer by its inherent quality than imposed on it by the observer's worldview and interest. That is, reality counts more than selective perception in the remembering of most events most of the time. When you see a Mack truck coming at you, in other words, you get out of the way. Perception, you can decide it's not a Mack truck, or you may perceive it as something else, but you better move quickly. Even more, if we do not know the past as Leopold von Ranke wished to know it, that is, as it essentially was, not as it actually was, as the typical quotation gives it. If we do not know the past as it essentially was, how could we know that a given representation of the past is fabricated? How could we know whether it's authentic? If human memory were typically a construction or a fabrication, it would utterly confound us by annihilating rather than merely distorting reality. Now we're worried about distortion's limits. Because constructionism is so evident in the way memory problems are selected and defined, its merits as well as limitations have got to be acknowledged. Constructionism, the conviction that collective memory depends more on contingencies of social experience than on qualities of the entities remembered, at least compels recognition that the past differs from what it now seems to have been, and the number of examples of this is quite limitless. Indeed, there are no memories that remain the same forever or immutable within a given place, because memory is always an approximation, never a reproduction. Constructionism, the conviction that collective memory depends more on contingencies of social experience than on the qualities of the events remembered, at least compels recognition that the past differs from what it now seems to have been, and the number of examples of this is limitless. Indeed, there are no memories that remain the same forever or immutable within any given place, because memory is always an approximation, never a reproduction of the past. Its content must be partially warped. But how much warping of memory does it take to distort it? This is the matter in question. Two procedures help to define the limits of distortion. The first is exemplified by Frederick Bartlett's famous memory experiments. Why, after reading to his subject a Native American folktale titled The War of the Ghosts, a story of a mythical battle to the death involving supernatural forces, Bartlett asked his students to replicate the story 20 minutes later. Take a pencil, write down what you said. Applying the repeated reproduction method, he asked the same subjects to reproduce the stories in later times, a week later, a month later. Within each successive reproduction, the story became shorter and more coherent with fewer mentions of supernatural powers. Even the order of events was changed. Also, the sacred narrative became mundane, a transformation involving omissions, simplification, and translation of esoteric into familiar detail. Gradually, a Native American folktale became a story that any Englishman could understand. Bartlett's aim was to get his students to distrust their own memory. The problem, however, a problem which lessens the generalizability of his experiments, is that his design deprives subjects of key resources essential to remembering. He's asking them to remember, but first taking away the things that they need to remember. Aside from his test narratives being irrelevant to most of his students' interests, he failed to warn them that they'd be tested and that something of importance might depend on their test performance. Because Bartlett's subjects believed, and quite correctly, that their responses would be inconsequential, they relied on the default option, performing as, quote, cognitive misers, unquote, treating the information indifferently and impassively, condensing and simplifying, reducing it to a simple and familiar and British schematic structure. Well, most people must be cognitive misers in order to organize in their minds the vast amount of information to which they're daily exposed. Take a plumber or an electrician, a doctor. Who in the hell has time to remember the details of the Iraq War? Nobody. And therefore, they become cognitive misers. They condense and simplify why the war. But in many situations, people have a powerful interest in remembering details accurately. Students preparing for career-determining examinations, military air controllers taking messages from besieged soldiers, detectives sorting through forensic evidence, science historians and scientists brooding over their data. These persons, among others, are highly motivated to remember because their interests depend on it. The ignoring or simplifying of information in one realm thus enables people to remember lengthy and complex details in realms that are most relevant to them. And there is a second procedure which I'll just summarize for you. This is Elizabeth Loftus' famous study, which shows students a film. And the film shows one car hitting the next. And she will ask the students, well, how fast, was the car A going when he hit car B? And, the speed depended on the words that she used to describe the situation. How fast were the cars moving when they collided into one another was one question. Experimental group 2, how fast were they moving when they smashed into one another? Well, there was only a 10-mile-an-hour difference, you see, in the estimates of these two groups. So what Elizabeth Loftus' experiment did was to underestimate the efficiency of memory by overemphasizing its small variations. Absence of extreme estimates is also evidence in conformity studies of ASH, where Confederate estimates influence subjects' later estimates of lines, the length of lines, and Sharif's great experiment on perceived movement of a stationary light. And you get people into a dark room, there's a light, how far has it moved? Well, it hasn't moved 10 feet, it's moved maybe an inch or half an inch, and so forth. Okay. Well, in these and all other experimental trials, memory regularly distorts reality to some degree, especially under conformity pressure, as in the Loftus and the Ash and Sharif experiments, but always within a limited range. And this limit confirms reality's constraint on the malleability of perception. Conclusion. In my talk today, questions about collective memory began with the distinction between its typical and its atypical types. I've tried to show how collective memory gets started, how it emerges from interacting eyewitnesses and is transmitted as an emergent fact to succeeding generations. And finally, I've tried to demonstrate that historical reality is one of the factors, in some cases the major factor, determining what gets transmitted. Most people will recognize that my application of collective memory theory is open to the charge of naive optimism, of exaggerating the soundness of what we know about the past and underestimating what we don't know. And who knows, they're probably right. But at least I've exaggerated in the right direction. Also, a general point and final point remains to be made. The present state of collective memory scholarship cannot be divorced from the assault on objectivity which began during the last third of the 20th century. We still find ourselves in the afterglow of this era, this postmodern era, with its hyper-realities and multiple truths. We're still fighting the science wars of this same era, when scholars struggled over scientific discoveries, including the definite breakthroughs in physics and chemistry, as actually just social constructs, conclusions not about nature, but about scientists talking to each other. Prevailing beliefs about history, commemoration, and memory are the products of this post-truth climate, one which subjects the content of our memories to the criterion of truthiness rather than truth itself. A time in which memory's failure is its distinctive feature, especially when the substance of that failure concerns minority claims to historical oppression and injustice. Here we confront an issue for future days. How close is the affinity between belief that the past is reconstructible and so society reformable, and the social justice ideology so closely related to the politics of the academic left? Realism and constructionism in this specific respect are aspects of the politics of memory. Realists, I think, tend to be far more conservative than constructionists, and more given to skepticism and belief in the successful re-engineering of history and society. In any case, this question, although it begs to be answered, takes us into hot water. And so I'll stop before anyone gets burned.